Brock. We have about 25 or 30 questions on high-speed rail. My capable staff says that they are arranged thematically. Now, what that means, I'm not altogether sure, but they're all together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a few of these out. And we'll then respond to each of these little clusters. The first one says, Senator, you support the concept of high-speed rail in California, but want it done right. It's easy to support a concept if it doesn't have a price tag. If you believe the cost of high-speed rail would be a minimum of $66 billion, and that's the questioner's number, not mine, and that California faces tremendous financial challenges, how can you continue to support the high-speed rail concept? Next one. See, there's another interested party. Proposition 1A was deeply flawed and superficial. It is now clear that it was grossly premature. Now we have a political fight with the only real support for the project coming from the construction trade unions. I have to say, respectfully, I think that that's an inaccurate assessment, and I'll come back to that. How can state representatives possibly support a flawed project which can only be a detriment to the taxpayers? You're right, Brock. There does seem to be a theme here. What do you think about the research report that shows 62.4% of California voters would vote to stop high-speed rail? Would you support a proposition to repeal Prop 1A and cancel or suspend high-speed rail indefinitely? Question. You have always asserted that the majority of Californians support the high-speed rail. I don't think I've always asserted that. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now that a recent poll shows that a majority would vote against it, is there some way to reflect the will of the majority? Questions. 3 of them. What would the process be to cancel high-speed rail in its entirety? Number 2, are we there yet? 3, where does the governor stand on this issue? Okay. Anything else that falls into that thematic category? That's it for now. Okay. Where to begin? I have said for some time that I support the concept of high-speed rail done right. People have, I think, then understandably and appropriately said, and exactly what does high-speed rail done right look like? What does that phrase mean? What that phrase means to me is that we have a high-speed rail project that makes sense financially, that is, in fact, financially sound, that's doable. Second, that there is, in fact, a statewide system, not some incoherent collection of individual projects that have no real statewide connection. And third, that the High-Speed Rail Authority engage with the community in a way that is more responsible and responsive, which to date they have not been able to do in my observation. Some of you know that for a couple of years, my colleague in the Senate, Senator Alan Lowenthal, and I were really the sort of two, I don't know if you can have two lone voices, but we were the two lone voices trying to raise some of these issues in the aftermath of the passage of the bond back in 2008. I will tell you, and when we had this conversation last year here in the chambers, a number of folks were surprised when I said, you know, there really aren't that many other members of the legislature who are tuned in on this issue. And people looked a little startled, and then I think began to do a little investigation and discovered that that was in fact the case. That has changed in the last year. I will tell you that there are far more members of the legislature who are attentive and engaged and who are frankly skeptical. And at least one of my colleagues, a Republican state senator named Doug LaMalfa, came forward with a bill to just say, stop. Just stop. So that's by way of a little background. I continue to believe that as a concept, to underscore the point that somebody made in their question, high-speed rail has the potential to benefit California. from a transportation planning standpoint, from a land use planning standpoint, and from an economic development standpoint. That being said, I am less optimistic today than I have ever been about the ability of the High-Speed Rail Authority to pull its act together and get it done. I continue to be frustrated by the trips, stumbles, and falls around community engagement. We are seeing similar struggles up and down the state in the Central Valley and in Southern California. I do not think that, and I don't think that it is fair to characterize anyone who raises a legitimate question or concern as a NIMBY. It's not the way you sort out problems. I've been in the public arena for a pretty long time now, and the thing I've learned is you got to listen to people, and listening doesn't always mean agreeing, but you got to listen. And you know, if you're a talker like I am, that takes some learning, but you got to listen. And I think that the High-Speed Rail Authority is taking a very long time to learn that lesson. We will see in 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, a business plan from the High-Speed Rail Authority that will be in draft form and available for comment, and I think it will be a watershed moment for high-speed rail. And I say that because I think people's patience is running out, both in the public and in the state legislature. There are some obvious questions that have been asked and have yet to be answered. Some of them have to do with ridership projections. And the ridership projections we've seen to date have not been persuasive to most objective analysts. We need to see what the ridership projections look like in the new business plan that comes out in a couple of weeks. Some of the questions have to do with funding, and obviously funding and revenue to support the project has a lot to do with ridership. But there are other questions as well, like where will the rest of the money come from? The project is currently thought to be a $40+ billion project by the High-Speed Rail Authority. As you heard, at least one of the questioners has an expectation that it'll be tens of billions more than that. Whether you're a $40+ billion or a $60+ billion person, you can pretty quickly figure out that if there's $10 billion in the mix from state bond measures, that leaves a lot to be accounted for. The situation in the federal government is rather clearly very different than it was just a year ago. A year ago, there was probably some good reason to think that federal funds would be forthcoming in some significant degree. Today, I think it's hard to be optimistic about that. Now, the world can change quickly, as we've seen, but it's a little hard to know on what you would premise an expectation of billions or tens of billions of dollars in federal funding given the current circumstances in the national capital. On the more local scene, some of you will recall that back in April, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo and I, along with my legislative colleague Rich Gordon, the Assembly member, put forward a proposal for what we called a blended system. And I won't speak for my colleagues, but I think it's fair to say, our fundamental case was this. Look, it does not make sense to be talking about an immense project from San Francisco to San Jose when A, the dollars are not there, B, it's unnecessarily disruptive, and C, it's largely duplicative of what we have available in an existing corridor. Wouldn't it make more sense, we argued, to scrap the plan for a 60-foot viaduct running up and down the corridor, to acknowledge that you will stay within the existing right-of-way for Caltrain so that homeowners and business owners didn't have to worry about whether or not they were going to be pushed aside. And third and finally, please shelve the notion of an environmental impact report that focuses on a mega project, because even if you don't build it or can't build it or never will be able to build it, if you've approved a environmental document for a mega project, even if it never gets built, that casts a pall over the entire corridor, because for 5, 10, 20, or 30 years, people are going to be saying, well, someday that may happen, if in fact that's what the environmental documents were prepared for. We've asked that all of that be put aside, and that instead the High-Speed Rail Authority come back and talk to us all from San Francisco to San Jose about a blended system that integrates high-speed rail with a 21st century Caltrain. A 21st century Caltrain would be electrified, and it would have something called positive train control, which is a fancy way for saying let's make sure we've got some computers that keep us from bumping into each other, and that would allow us to move more quickly, more trains. And we feel that if you do that, you can eliminate much, not all, much of the disruption and reduce the cost by many billions. As it happens, just yesterday, the High-Speed Rail Authority issued its first response to that request. So after 6 months, we have the response. And I think, and now I'm paraphrasing their language, their first response was, we can do without the viaduct, although we appreciate the fact that you've said if a city wants a viaduct, that you wouldn't oppose that. And they're right. So if you all want a viaduct, go to it. The second thing is they said they could substantially stay within the right-of-way, that there are some places where they might need 5 or 10 feet, but substantially stay within the right-of-way. And the third issue, which is not yet resolved, is the issue of whether or not they can scale back the EIR. I am firmly convinced, as someone who works in this field, that they can. And I thought we had a good conversation with their legal representation from the Attorney General's office when they came to speak to the budget subcommittee that I chair earlier in the year. Some of you were there. And I thought ultimately the Attorney General's office said out loud what was a fairly common sense thing, which is, well, yes, if you are prepared to scale the project back, then you only have to do an environmental document for the redefined scaled back project, not for a project you don't have any plan on doing. So I think we can get there. All of that being said, I want to clarify a couple of things. One is, I don't see a commitment to a blended system as being the end of the conversation. I see a commitment to a blended system as the beginning of a conversation. My view has been that until and unless we get a commitment for what I've characterized as the blended system, there's nothing to talk about, because the proposals that have been on the table are practically non-starters. They are non-starters in terms of cost, and they are non-starters in terms of disruption to the corridor, and they are non-starters in terms of community opposition. So we will, if we can get to yes on the blended system, then, in my view, have the basis for an intelligent conversation up and down the peninsula. I have not suggested, and I think, I fault myself for perhaps not being clear about this. I am not suggesting that the blended system is the answer or the solution. I'm suggesting, as I said, that it's the starting point for a conversation. If you oppose high-speed rail, you can still oppose high-speed rail, but say, we shouldn't even be talking about anything but a blended system. If you support high-speed rail, you can say, I support high-speed rail, but we need to see a blended system if I'm going to continue to be a supporter of high-speed rail. It is the starting point for a conversation. And then the last thing I'll say before we go on to the next batch of cards is this. We are expected to see this business plan in 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. At that point, it will be 3 years since the bond measure passed. If after 3 years you haven't got a business plan worthy of the name, then I think it's very tough to go forward. And again, folks, I know that on this issue, there are some of you who say, for God's sakes, why don't you just say you support high-speed rail? There are others who say, for God's sakes, why don't you just say you oppose high-speed rail? I do think it is important to note there was an election. The bond measure passed. It may have passed narrowly, but it passed. Elections have consequences. You get stuck with the folks you elect for 4 years, whether you're happy with them every day of their 4-year term in office. In this case, the bond measure got approved. Is it possible for us to unwind that? Yeah, but I want you to stop and think about what a dramatic thing that is for elected officials to essentially take action contrary to the expressed will of the public, absent some other ballot measure, which is a possibility. But I do think, and I have said repeatedly to the folks at the High-Speed Rail Authority, if after 3 years you don't have a business plan that really does address these issues of ridership and funding, it's going to be very tough to generate support going forward, blended system or not, in the area that I happen to represent and care most specifically about. So stay tuned. We'll see what happens in the next couple of weeks. I think this really is a watershed moment. As to where the governor is, not clear. I will tell you, I mentioned earlier, for those of you who are here from the very beginning, I think the governor has struggled to tackle some of the other problems that are on his to-do list because of his focus, understandable, on the budget during the first 6 months of the year. I got a call back in March, I think, from someone in the governor's office saying, we need to sit down and talk about high-speed rail. Would you be willing to be part of that conversation down here in the governor's office? I said, of course. About a week and a half later, they said, we're going to hold off on that. We'll get back to you. Phone hasn't been ringing off the hook on that subject since. And I think part of the reason for that is that the governor and his folks are still trying to figure out where they want to go. As everyone in this room has reason to know, this is a more complicated issue than it might appear at first blush, and I think the governor and his folks are quickly figuring that out, that there aren't easy or quick answers given the challenges. I'm going to add one more last thing to the last thing I said I would share with you, and that is, do we have any press here today, just out of curiosity? Any press in the room, just out of curiosity? There we go. Thanks. Well, we're going to break some news. You ready? I got tired of hearing people make absolute assertions about where the community was on the issue of high-speed rail. And so I thought, well, next time I go do some polling, I'll ask. So here's what I know based on polling in our area. And I'll share it with you just so you have some facts. And you know, I didn't have any predisposition about what the answer should be. I was curious to know, what is the answer? Most of you know that the statewide ballot measure passed, what was it, 52, 53% 3 years ago? In our area, and by that I mean the 11th Senate District, it passed close to 60-40, as I recall, somewhere in that vicinity. And 12 of the 13 cities and towns that I represent voted for the measure, Atherton being the dissenter among the 13 cities and towns that I represent. So 60-40 in our area. I asked in a recent survey if the ballot measure, if the bond were on the ballot again today, would you vote for the $9-10 billion bond for high-speed rail linking Northern and Southern California? And it was a toss-up. It was split right down the middle. A statistical margin of error, right down the middle. Maybe a couple of points one way or the other, but basically split down the middle. An interesting follow-up question, at least interesting to me, was would you support continuing the project if you knew that the cost and the source of funds were uncertain, that the cost of the project and the source of the funds for the project were uncertain? And by an almost 2-to-1 margin, people said no. So there is clearly a great deal of concern, at least in my area, our area, about the fact that we're not really sure how much this project is going to cost going forward, and we're not really clear where the money is going to come from. And that seems to be a big issue of concern to people that I polled in an effort to sort of get a sense for where they are. So it's not that I really thought that either of those two factors were going to be helpful in any big sense, but I did think it was sort of important to have some numbers that I could look at and say they weren't brought to us by someone who had an agenda one way or the other. This is what folks in my area said when we asked them. Split almost down the middle on whether or not they would support the project if it were on the ballot again today, very different than the 60-40 that we had 3 years ago, and a great deal of anxiety about the fact that if we don't know what the project's going to cost and we don't know where the money's going to come from, continuing is a source of concern. Why don't I stop there and see what the next group are, because I want to try and respect everybody's time. Well, the first question is, why did you travel to Azerbaijan? I'm going to, I don't think that falls into the high-speed rail category. We'll come back to that one if we have time. These folks say, we're against the high-speed rail project because of the impact on our property and community. Many middle and lower economic income people will be hurt by this project. Please consider this. This money could be used for much better, more critical uses. Thank you. Including quality education for California children. All right. Will the governor take into account the effect high-speed rail debt will have on future budgets? How can he rationalize, there we go, high-speed rail spending when education, et cetera, will suffer? And here I think the questioner is talking about the fact that our debt service is going up in California. So if you look at our $86 billion a year general fund budget, an increasingly large proportion of that budget is going to pay debt on California bonds. For years, Californians have thought of bond measures as free money. I think it's important that we remember this isn't free money. You have to not only pay back the money, you have to pay the interest costs of the money. For fiscal conservatives, that's always been an issue. But for folks who are worried about our increasing inability to adequately fund public education and health and welfare, it's also now an issue. So you have an interesting conversation taking place in the Capitol that perhaps didn't take place 10 years ago between folks who are self-styled fiscal conservatives and folks who think of themselves as social progressives, who both share the concern about the fact that a rising percentage of our state budget goes to debt service. Next comment or question. The High-Speed Rail Center request to the Finance Department asking for $65 million from 2010 funds for right-of-way prep. Sources say this isn't lawful. Will you vote against this until the business plan is released? On that question, and again, gotta love this district. Everybody knows what's going on. Yes, the High-Speed Rail Authority did ask for some additional funding for right-of-way, and the request went as a matter of process to something called the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. The Joint Legislative Budget Committee then asked those of us who have been involved in high-speed rail issues what we thought, and I asked my office to send back word to the Joint Legislative Budget Committee that I thought it was an inappropriate request at this time, given the fact that we still didn't have a business plan after 3 years, and that before we started going down the path of acquiring right-of-way to any greater degree than we have thus far, we ought to see the business plan and have an opportunity to assess whether or not we think the business plan is worthy. It says, would you be interested in a complaint, would you be interested in a, compliant, not complaint, okay, forgive me. Would you be interested in a 100% AB 3034 compliant business plan for Caltrain? And the next one is, what kind of rigor will legislators require in the upcoming business plan as far as the quest for capital? Would you allow the project to start in the hope of Congress passing infrastructure bank legislation for rail? In the past, when we've asked the High-Speed Rail Authority, so what do you do if you don't get any more money? The initial response was that the expenditures of the $10 billion would be for projects that had what is known as independent utility. And you're all having exactly the same look on your face that I did, which is, what on earth does that mean? And independent utility means if we're going to go spend some high-speed rail money over here, or over here, or over here, if it turns out we run out of money, is there independent utility value, worth, product for the money we spent over here and over here and over here? In other words, on a standalone basis, would it have value if we just suddenly say one day we're out of money and we have to stop? That has been the policy rationale that the High-Speed Rail Authority has offered. It's a little hard to put that into context when, as some of you know, the High-Speed Rail Authority has decided to do its first big real project in the Central Valley, which is an area that is not particularly heavily developed. Now, I have to tell you, some folks in our corridor and in Southern California said, good, let them go to the Central Valley. Others said, no, we could have used the jobs and the economic development here, and by the way, it would be great to upgrade our existing corridors if they could figure out that's the right way to do it. But it's a little hard to know how a project in the Central Valley in a largely undeveloped area has independent utility if the whole thing comes to a stop one day soon. I have not taken a position on the Central Valley project. I'm sort of more focused on the big picture statewide and on the San Francisco to San Jose corridor, because that's an area where I have a responsibility to represent you all. But the Central Valley project, and again, the authority makes what I think is a fair argument, which is, if we're going to do this, and it's hard, and this is our first stretch of real track, why don't we do it in a place that has fewer challenges, is less developed, and where we can learn by experience under less challenging circumstances. I think the authority might acknowledge today it's proved to be pretty challenging even in that part of the state. Folks there are not happy to be thought of as a place where there isn't anything to worry about. They think there's plenty to worry about. So I do think one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is, if the money runs out, do we have the rail equivalent of, you remember when we used to see the freeway overpasses that just stopped in the middle and you kind of wondered where they were supposed to go? You don't want to see $10 billion worth of that in the rail world. So I think that the authority will be in a position of having to explain to us what is the independent utility, what is the value added, what is the standalone merit of the projects you would do if you continue to go forward, unless we see in the business plan a compelling argument that another $30–40 billion can be identified, and I'm frankly not terribly hopeful that's going to be the case. What are the consequences to the state if high-speed rail authority is wrong about revenue and ridership estimates? Well, this is one where we have to make sure that the consequences to the state aren't high-speed rail authority showing up 10 years from now and saying, you know what, we need another $10 or $20 billion bond measure, because that wasn't the deal, that wasn't the understanding. And while I think all of us are worldly enough to understand that projects often end up costing more than initially anticipated, having essentially a bait and switch to the tune of another $10 billion, I think, is unacceptable. Next question: how will the legislature vet the work done by Cambridge Systematics, given they were given a no-bid contract by PB, Parsons Brinckerhoff, and they have indemnified the state for any mistakes or errors? Excuse me? They have not indemnified the state, I think. They have not. I think the word "not" is missing. I think the only answer I would give is I do think there are increasing numbers of members of the legislature who are willing to give this information a hard and skeptical look. And by skeptical, I don't mean cynical, and I don't mean negative. I just mean skeptical. I think in my office we actually have a motto, which is that I want my staff to bring skepticism but not cynicism to the work we do when we deal with various state agencies. And we understand that everybody has a case to make, and we're happy to let them make it, but we need to be skeptical, not cynical, about it when we hear from various folks that all is well and there's nothing to worry about. I do think there are an increasing number of members who are skeptical but not cynical. And I think that answers all of the questions in that packet. Brock? And folks, shall we stay for another 5 or 10 minutes and try and wrap this up? Is that okay? 12 was our originally scheduled time. Okay. MTC agreed to help facilitate high-speed rail on the peninsula at the request of the Bay Area Council Business Group. Why? Getting 9 counties involved in peninsula decisions is not desirable to some cities. I have to say I am skeptical about MTC's potential involvement. I know the Bay Area Council, which is a Bay Area business group, has thought that perhaps the MTC could play the role of honest broker. I have told the folks at the Bay Area Council that I am personally skeptical about MTC. I've worked closely with MTC, this is the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. And it is comprised of representatives from the 9 Bay Area counties. They are there to do work on a host of regional transportation issues. The Bay Area Council, which is a business organization in the Bay Area, has thought that the Metropolitan Transportation Commission might be a useful player, participant in this process. I just will tell you I'm skeptical about MTC in general, based on my work with them over the past decade in the legislature and prior to that during my time in local government. I mean no disrespect, I just mean to say I'm a skeptic. With federal high-speed rail money drying up, can we use the California $9 billion bond money to electrify Caltrain now? Probably not. And I say that because I do think that it's important that the $9 billion out of the almost $10 billion that was authorized be used consistent with state law and with the reasonable expectations of the voters. In fact, I had some folks who questioned when we put the blended system proposal forward, is this really just a ruse to fund your local commuter service? And the answer is no. It's probably unlawful, and even if it wasn't unlawful, it's not something I would support. I thought the blended system was an acknowledgement that doing the paying twice for the same corridor unnecessarily didn't make sense, and that we could have the best of both worlds if we could sort of stop talking about this duplicative and costly and disruptive system. But to simply say, can't we just take that money and use it for commuter purposes rather than high-speed rail purposes, not allowed. AB 952 passed the legislature to strengthen the conflict of interest laws, specifically as it concerns the high-speed rail authority. The governor vetoed the bill. Can you override the veto? Theoretically, yes. According to our civics books, we can. As a practical matter, it's a highly unlikely event. There has not been a veto override for any legislation with any governor since Governor Brown was last governor all those years ago, more than a quarter of a century ago. With every independent agency who has examined the program saying it has major problems, is there truly a way to stop this project, talking about high-speed rail? If it can't be done right, can it be stopped? And once started, how can a project like this be stopped? Think Big Dig in Boston. What qualifies as a boondoggle? I do not believe that boondoggle is defined in the California Code. Pretty much everything else is, but not boondoggle. I want to just go back to an answer I gave earlier, which was that I really do think that we're at a watershed moment. You know, I know there's no end of reports and dates and requirements and obligations, but come October 15th, we were supposed to have the report, the business plan. The High-Speed Rail Authority said we need a few more weeks, and I actually, on the one hand, while that's frustrating to me because it's like, you know, are we constantly trying to drag the information out of these folks that we need? I have some reason to think that the reason for the delay is that there are some new members of the High-Speed Rail Authority Board who are asking some new and important questions, and if an extra couple of weeks means those questions are going to get asked and addressed, then good, because they're questions that need to be asked and answered. But that being said, I really do think, I mean, there'll be a comment period. The legislature will then be back in session in January, and I think at that point, you know, it's going to be very tough if after 3 years we don't have good answers and the High-Speed Rail Authority does not have a business plan worthy of the name. I think people are going to have to sort of pull themselves up short and say, where are we? This can't keep going on. 3 years is a long time. I mean, I think it's fair to say, look, big change in responsibilities after the bond measure, small entity that was primarily a planning and advocacy organization, overnight responsible for a $40 billion plus mega project. That's going to take some time to transition. Okay, 6 months, a year. 3 years, not okay. So I think that's where a lot of my colleagues are likely to be. And then going back into the question.